Welcome to the sixth session about Lebanon outcomes. Is it possible to legalize gangs? The chair is Nele Hansen and keynote is Sonia Páez de la Torre y Begoña Aramayona. The participants are Héctor Grat, Ana San Martín, Sabina Puig, Javier Navarro, Roger Soler, René Hunda, and Mercedes Botija. We ask you to please respect the schedules since at 1 is lunchtime. Thank you.
Okay, good morning again. I want to present the participants of this table. First, here is Sonia Páez de la Torre. She holds an international PhD in education from the University of Girona. Currently, she is a Margarita Salas postdoctoral researcher and member of the Jovis COM UPF team, where she collaborates in different projects. She has been the project manager of the LEBAN project and also scientific coordinator of the work package 2, because there were different work packages included in LEBAN. Sonia, you want to explain very briefly the LEBAN project, and then I will go on.
Okay, no, maybe with my presentation I will talk about what has been LEBAN project. We can begin with the. I can use this one or no? Yes. Okay. So I will give some notes about the development, the scope, and the future investigation around LEBAN project. That it was a national project related with TRANSGANG. Sometimes we said that it's a little sister or a daughter of TRANSGANG. And so first I will talk about the starting points and the initial research questions of the LEBAN project. And I will refer also to the situation of gangs when the project began. After that, I will read some brushstrokes of the most representative milestones connected to gangs in Spain, Ecuador, and El Salvador, because I think this will be helpful for our audience to understand the frame and also the interventions of our participants, and maybe this is useful also for the discussion. In the third moment, I would like to underline some of the achievements of the research that we all carry out, and after all that, I will give some lines or maybe some points that can perhaps be thought of as future lines of the research. In 2006, the Ministry of Justice of Catalan government legally recognized the cultural organization of Latin kings and queens of Catalonia. The following year, in 2007, it did the same with the Nieta Sociocultural Sport and Musical Association. While this legalization process was happening in Barcelona, in the same period, Madrid opted for criminalizing these groups. But nevertheless, what was baptized as Barcelona's model was an attempt to replicate in another autonomous communities of Spain, such as Valencia community, the Balearic Islands, and Navarra. And regarding to the international scene, inspired by the Catalan experience, in 2008, the Ecuadorian government recognized the Corporation of Latin Queens and Kings, initiating a pacification process with positive effects. And on the other hand, after many years of repression between 2009 and 2014, there was an attempt truce with the Mara Salvatrucha and the Barrio 18 gangs in El Salvador. This experience was successful in a short term, but ended up failing. And after that, punitive policies against these groups grew in the country. So, gangs in Spain, Ecuador, and El Salvador have acquired different forms and positions depending on the public policies that have been applied. And also, we can think that we can thought that it depends on the social integration or the exclusion process that each territory have done with youth streets. So in order to understand what place gangs and their members occupy in our society, a contrast case study research was built. The study was interested in the analysis of those territories in which the intervention policies focus on mediation and therefore the integration of these groups, along with others where the hard hand policies had led to increased exclusion, violence, and marginalization of these groups. The aim of the project was to look back, trying to recover the spirit of the historical and political context in which the recognition of the criminalization experience with youth groups street took place with, analyzing what worked and what failed. So for that, we carry out a macro analysis of social perception around gangs based on big data and also by applying a survey. In a second work package, we try to analyze public policies and judicial decisions. In a third work package, we decide to realize ethnographic work at the local level to observe the evolution of Latino gangs and their members and to inquire about the results and consequences that the experience of legalization or criminalization had for the different social actors involved in the process. And finally, in the work package 4, we wanted to carry out an evaluation of the strength and weakness of this process, link it to a repertoire of good practice at the local and global level. So, some brush strokes about the most relevant milestones about gangs in each territory. First of all, speaking in what is Spain context, we can say that this phenomenon of youth streaks group is marked by the migratory waves of the early 21st century and in parallel by the times of economic crisis or bonanza times of good economical stability. No? In this sense, we can distinguish two stages. The first one between 2000 and 2009, where the economical stability and the significant arrival of the transnational migrant population from Latin America, Asia, North Africa, and Eastern Europe arrived. And here we should also point that between 2000 and 2005, families' reunification process were carried out mainly for the Latin American people. And in the second stage, between 2009 and 2020, there was a global economic crisis. Among the consequences of this crisis, apart from the increase of the unemployment, the precariousness of employment, and the application of austerity policies, there was an implementation of a new Spanish immigratory law. But going to Barcelona's case, no? Although they already exist, in 2003, Barcelona media made visible Latin youth groups because of the murder of Ronnie Tapia, a young boy originally from Colombia. There was a multifactorial situation that we could summarize by pointing the presence of key actors working for and with young people, also in the third sector, in the academic and in public administration, who tried not to intervene in this situation with another perspective and in an experimental way. So as I have already mentioned, in 2006, there was a regularization and a recognition process of these groups. So during the second half of the decade, the activity of these two legalized entities, the Latin Kings and the Nieta, was remarkable. They worked separately and collaborative in projects such as United for the Flow. But however, when the crisis arrived, a political change caused a step back in the forms of intervention. That's because of the police persecution in 2014 began, and we can now point a macro raid against the non-regularized sector that opposed the legalization of the Latin Kings of Catalonia. Although this initiative was not entirely profitable, since in 2020 this sentence was finally absolving, But we can observe that there was some ambiguous use of policy practice and also a criminalization media coverage of the youth street groups. Currently, there seems to be a shift in the media paradigm from the gangs to the menas that we have also pointed yesterday. And also, there is an inactivity practice of the groups. No? They are not doing things as a group. So that was also a question, no? What has happened with this group and what happened after the legalization process. Regarding to Madrid, in 2004, there was also a media discovery of the phenomenon of gangs caused by the murder of Kim Maestro. This leads to a media hypervisibility that sought to force an alarmist and stigmatizing discourse. And in 2006, the first collective arrest of members of the Latin Kings took place in this territory. In 2007, there was the first trial of one of the Madrid faction of the groups, the state one, and in which they were accused of illicit association, threats, and coercion. In 2010, there was 2 new trials, and that the respective sentence ordered the dissolution of this entire group of Latin kings and queens in Madrid. So the criminalization dynamics frustrated those incipient mediation processes that were beginning to arise in Madrid. And finally, we should point out that the fact that last year there was the death of 2 young people in the neighborhood of Atocha and Usera that intensified the new media cycle focused on violence and crime related to these conflicts and to gangs. Regarding to Ecuador, well, this state has produced excluding and authoritarian forms of government characterized by the prevalence of the privilege of the economic elites. Street gangs emerged in 1908, mainly in Quito and Guayaquil. In the 1999, a million town called Feriado Bancario caused a massive migration, especially from Ecuadorian people to Spain. And in 2007, it began a progressive cycle carried out by the government of Correa. And in that period, inspired by the Catalan experience and supported by the leaders like Justin King, who has been part of the legalization process in Barcelona, and by other actors from the Ecuadorian academia and also from the third sector entities such as Serpaz and Cefosinde, they began a process of pacification, institutional recognition of the original Sagrada Tribu Atahualpa de Ecuador with the Latin Kings. In 2011, the government launched the National Plan for Comprehensive Citizen Security that focused control from a holistic perspective and set aside the preventive reactive model of police. What else? In 2006, the first collective, I lose my notes here. So, but between the 2017 and the 2023, there was a turn towards austerity and neoliberalism policies. No? And in 2022, King Majesty, leader of the Corporation of Kings and Queens of Ecuador, who played a central role in the legalization process, was murdered. And in Salvador, this case represents a clear case of the application of a criminalization and punitive action against poor youth, and especially against the maras and gangs in a context of high structural and symbolic violence of daily life. The Mara Salvatrucha and the Barrio 18 are groups that emerged in the country with the deportation of many young Salvadorians raised in the United States. And since 1919, the gangs appears as a social and media object, as a threat to public security, gaining presence in political discourse and electoral strategies. Since 2000, particularly with the arrival of the arenas as political power, arena party arrived to the power, and the representative level of the authority increased. No? The repressive level of the authorities increased. In this sense, new laws against the gangs were approved, and there have been a lot of plans, such as Super Mano Dura and Mano Dura, that have increased violence in the persecution to gangs. No? And I have already mentioned that the truce failed between 2012 and 2014, but it is also important to point that during these months in which the truce was forced, there was it was registered a decrease in the homicides and in the violence. And as we know, well, in this country now, with the presence of Bukele, these repressive actions are still in practice. No, the results of the projects are a lot, and they are available in our web. And also, well, now Begoña will focus on the book. But maybe we should point some ideas and some generalized ideas that we have discussed on these meetings and seminaries. We have asked and we have discussed of the meaning of gang in Spain and Salvador or Ecuador, and we also discussed about the social representation that exists around groups and their members in each context. We wonder why, how, and from what place they are created this sense. We also discuss the influence and the responsibility that the media have on social representations of gangs and the impact that this representation has on shaping public opinion. The social construction of the gang object as the social representation, construction of the gang as has been influenced by the media coverage of the phenomenon that associate gangs with violence, delinquencies, and social dangers. And also we have thought and discussed the application of this security or insecurity discourse of gang built as a social object to be feared and hated that has been a strategy of neoliberal governments. No? So it was very important during the process, the intervention that different members of the team have done in the media, trying to reflect with the people, no, about what this means and what are the consequences of this representation and this construction. So the possibility of open process of mediations appears as an alternative to pacify the conflict, and with multiple opportunities and limitations for the production of a more inclusive and egalitarian societies in the Ibero-America context. And many of these reflections are expressed on our collective book, which is surely a reference for now on, no? in the study. Finally, to think all together about what are the lines that we can that can be thought of as future lines to research. Maybe we should think of continue analyzing the material that we have produced, no? The big data, the survey research results, and also the empirical data that the IP has for all the other projects. We should maybe explore the stories and the situation of other territories where there are also youth streets. There have also been, and we couldn't arrive to them, but we are in contact with people from Valencia and from Zaragoza that are interested in research this process, what are the results in these territories. Also, it is important because we are forging a network with Madrid with the third sector entities and the academia. We have been in a very interesting meeting, no, where we have discussed all the situation that now is very complicated. And so we think that it is important to continue researching and investigating the situation in Ecuador and in El Salvador. And keep thinking now about the integration alternatives, about solutions that are inclusive, related not to a restorative justice, that may be something that the project couldn't go in deep. And maybe also then Maria or Carlos can talk about the Youth Lab project, that is something about mediation that maybe it's also a good way to before finishing. Well, I would like to thank all the LEBAN team, because I think we have done a very, very successful work. And that's it. I leave the floor to Begoña. Thank you.
Pues antes que siga, before Begoña will go on, I just will briefly present Begoña. Begoña Aramayona. She is an urban studies researcher currently exploring processes of reproduction and resistance of informal nightlife and migration in Southern Europe, thanks to a Marie Curie grant at the University of Sheffield in the UK. She holds a PhD in social psychology since 2019 from the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid in Spain. So, Begoña, go ahead. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Sonia, also for the previous words, which are very useful for understanding the context of LEBAN. I've been participating in the team, in the coordination team, scientific coordination team, with Sonia, Edu, who couldn't be here, and Carlos as supervisor IP of the project. And I agree with Sonia that, I mean, it has been a collective effort, because many people have been implied in all the results that we're going to talk about today. So from my side also, I want to show my gratitude for the effort during these last 3 years. So I'm gonna set the timing, because I feel more comfortable controlling. And apologies, because I'm going kind of, I don't like to do this, but I'm going to kind of read part of my notes, because, you know, well, this language thing, I want to be very efficient with the timing. So today, I would like to present some key ideas, mainly related with the conclusions of the project, and how the questions, the young questions of the project changed through time, while we were, like, you know, going deep with the things that we wanted to explore. So, as Sonia was saying before, one of the original questions of and actually the title of this table was, is it possible to legalize gangs? And well, we realized that, you know, thanks to engaging with different scholars and debates, and also thanks to exploring both the planned and unplanned consequences of the experiences we analyzed, we thought, or we kind of, we thought that it might be useful to problematize that original question. So instead of asking ourselves, is it possible to legalize gangs, we could ask ourselves, well, is it desirable, or is it legalizing the best framework to think about youth street groups? And can we imagine which are the best interventions in order to wield the diversity of gangs or youth street groups in these variegated geographies that we're talking about? From the previous table, we realized that there is quite a diversity through different groups in different places. So to what extent these more like monolithic frameworks are useful, or we need to think of other alternatives. So I'm going to talk about just a bit of promotion. This is the book that we published as a result of the of this collective effort. Some of the things, some of the questions and key ideas that I'm going to talk about are part of the introduction of the book that I co-wrote with Eduard Ballester. So I invite you to read this chapter and the rest of the chapters if you're interested in what we're going to talk to speak today. And just as I mentioned, that anything that I can say today represents only my personal opinion as a researcher, not the whole perception of the team, but yeah. So I would like to start with this idea, that as Sonia was mentioning before, this retrospective aspiration to look into the past, what had happened in these places during the last 2 or 3 decades, was a fundamental approach of the LEBAN project. So I would like to start with this idea that was spoken in a podcast by Shusho Ayan, who's an archaeologist, because I think it represents quite well the spirit of and the main purpose of the project. So he said, sometimes the present makes us forget that there are other possibilities, not only in the past, but also in the future. And one thing that archaeology does is enhancing our imagination in a quite great place. I recall this idea because one fundamental aspiration of this project was to look into the past, to imagine diverse, more inclusive, more engaged, and just futures for these groups and generally for the youth. But we've tried to follow the rule of looking into the past to see not only what had indeed happened in these places, but what else could have happened. So what other paths, what other alternatives might have occurred if the constellation of factors would have been different. So following this idea, we try to overcome monolithic or stable representations of the past to give space to silences and absence and so on. This is important because in following this reflection, something that we argue in the introduction of the book is how to overcome categorical representation of different institutional strategies undertaken, which are often summarized in this idea of gangs in, gangs out model, bandas fuera, bandas dentro. So just to give you a brief summary, as Sonia was mentioning in the previous talk, institutional approaches towards the so-called gangs or just street groups is often divided between 2 different models, gangs in, gangs out. We address this in a paper written also with Carles in Análisis Político. And so we could summarize something like gangs out model, also that we can also call, this hard hand strategy or exclusionary model, is quite obvious in the sense that it represents all those experiences and institutional approaches, quite the majority, by the way, in which youth street groups are thought as a problem of society, and different strategies for reproducing criminalization, persecution, and surveillance of the groups are activated. So the exemplary cases in the context of this LEBAN project were El Salvador and Madrid as exemplary cases, where these processes of institutional dialogue and mediation with the groups has been permanently boycotted. They were never successful, and at least not as the other ones. And on the contrary, we have this gangs in model. We might resume or summarize all those experiences of mediation, dialogue, and eventually formalization of the groups in different legalized figures, such as, for example, civic associations, right, as the ones in Barcelona, and as a way to reduce violence and to make groups inside the society. So this model is often associated with narratives of legalization, which, in my opinion, is not entirely accurate, because those groups were not illegal when these processes of mediation got started. They were criminalized and persecuted, but they were not illegal, so we might need to maybe think about alternatives in that way. But anyway, in this model that we could also name as a soft hand strategy to deal with the groups, these narratives of inclusion of the groups are central. So one of the goals of this approach is not only fighting against stigma and persecution, but also producing certain processes of social inclusion of the groups into the society, make them less excluded. So for instance, the Barcelona model, that there's a chapter in the book that talks about it, that ended up with the constitution of some sections of Latin Quinceañeta as civics associations in 2006 and 2008, and the more recent examples of the Ecuador are exemplary cases of this gang scene approach. So as we argue in the introduction, we think that we might need to overcome this categorical framework in which we are often invited to think, even if we use it as a title, not only because neither of these examples or neither examples we can find in the real life anywhere is entirely pure, maybe with the exception of El Salvador, which has a persistent hard hand, but the rest of them are quite hybrid in that sense. And many processes are happening simultaneously through time and space. But also, we might need also to think to overcome these categorical dimensions because they fail to address how different interests between different actors are put in motion in these processes in a much more complex way. I'm precisely analyzing the changes in policies during the last 2 or 3 decades in these three different places, allow us to have a better picture of these potential alternatives and limits of its experience, and to imagine other alternatives, as Shushara-san was saying. So just to give you, we could start by taking for granted, I hope to taking for granted the following assumption, and is that these hard hand policies, this criminalization, surveillance, exclusionary processes do not work. I think there is a common shared agreement between probably much of the people that are in this room, but also between critical scholars, third agencies, NGOs, activists, left-oriented progressive parties, governments, and so on, that surveilling, persecuting, punishing, and using the whole tool of criminalizing and punitive strategies against this group do not resolve the violence and the conflict in the long term. Instead, it produces increasing amounts of violence and conflict on the long term, both between different groups and between the groups and the state. And it also produces more suffering and impunity for those young people and their communities and makes the groups more clandestine and into the shadows. However, it is worth it to say that there is an instrumental use of the hard hand policies. So in other words, these strategies do not solve the conflict, but are operative for other political and economical purposes. And as we see, the Salvadorian case, where the maras are right now not kind of a para-state that is used by absolutely all political parties for electoralist purposes, is quite representative. We could give many examples, but I prefer just to leave the rest of my colleagues to explore this in more depth. That said, which I just briefly mentioned, I think one of the main questions of this archaeological work undertaken through the project has been to analyze in detail which have been the implication of those other strategies, often called gang scene or soft hand strategies, through processes of institutional dialogue and mediation with judge street groups. And this is something that is profoundly analyzed in the chapter about Barcelona, and that we also acknowledge in the introduction. And I will summarize now. But what we have found, there is a myriad diversity of experiences of dialogue and mediation. This is quite complex, but most of them share a common starting point, which was a common understanding that the violence and deaths between groups were a matter of public worriness. So there was a common interest on dialoguing and mediating with the groups in order to reduce the violence, trying to listen to their needs, to the understandings of life, what they want for the future, making alliances with institutional actors, and producing alternative public discourses about these groups. And also trying to overcome stigmatizing and criminalizing representations about them. Most of these goals were fulfilling these experiences. However, there have been also some secondary effects that, to the date, they have not been fully addressed. So I will really summarize the 3 of them that I want to talk. The first one is the fragmentation and internal conflicts produced as a result of this mediation process. So critically, many of these social experiments have relied on institutional actors and entities to engage with the groups, such as scholars, local councils, members of the civic organization, and also regional and national police officers. And this has been made in a context in which, as you may know, many of these groups are reluctant with engaging with state actors, and particularly with police agents and or police security forces. So in this sense, throughout this research, we addressed that several conflicts and internal fragmentation inside the groups had happened, as only some sections decided to participate in these inclusive policies. So to what extent these internal conflicts represented a threat for the overall organization, that was something that we could address, or why those other sections that didn't want to participate, what were their motives. That's something that we could ask ourselves for the future. We only had access to those people that participated in the mediation. The second effect was that we also addressed in the introduction is something that Sonia was saying before, the dissolution or disappearance of the groups in some places. And particularly this political nature of the groups that happened during the 70s. You have a picture of the Latin Kings in New York and how they were, they were born as an organization that had in a very central position a radical critique against police abuse, against the whole system that excluded them from society and so on. Also, the Nietas had this very strong critique against the jail system and this support to prisoners and so on. So where all those features had went through these things happening during these 20, 30 years, right? That's something that we could also ask ourselves, what were the costs and sacrifices for this, for navigating these institutional and bureaucratic systems. And the third one, which might be maybe the most polemic argument, but I think important to say, is how the role of the police has been normalized through these processes of mediation. During the last 15 years, there have been born new forms of police agents, so apparently more sensitive to social issues, at least in the Spanish case, also in Ecuador, more willing to implement less aggressive strategies, focusing on prevention and mediation. And so, however, as critical security studies acknowledge, beyond the authentic will of certain individuals inside those groups to produce a more humanized police, we cannot face these initiatives in naive ways, and we really need to understand the broader social, economical, political context in order to make sense of these changes. So in this sense, understanding why this has happened can only be made if we take with high centrality the fact that during the last 30 years, neoliberal policies around the globe have fostered the so-called preventive turn. So whereas the welfare state disappears from those spaces of vulnerability and from the close relationship with these groups, the security or penal state appears instead in its double form. So you can see in many neighborhoods, for example, here in Barcelona, for sure in Madrid, how hard hand policies, the hard hand role of the police in many places, like doing racial identifications, surveillance of racialized youth, including members of the groups, but not only. It is one way of dealing with the social space, but also you can see how the police is occupying those spaces, such as, for example, prevention talks on how not to be part of a gang or how to engage with risky behaviors and so on in high schools. And this is something problematic because that is something new. These roles were traditionally occupied by social figures such as social workers, educational workers. So why we are normalizing that the police, with such a problematic history with marginalized communities and particularly with Jail Street groups, are occupying that place. And it's problematic because particularly these groups have a long tradition of having a problematic relationship with the police, and that's something that was also addressed, when these fragmentation processes happen, but also, I'm finishing with this, but also how the mediation of this type of role, so how all that information that was taken thanks to participating in the mediation process about the groups was later used against them once the processes of mediation ended, right? And this is something that for the future, we really need to think what to do with this, because we cannot, well, as William was saying in the previous table, we cannot engage with the groups in naive ways or trying, to think them in isolated terms, because they are part of a whole society, a whole structure that tries to persistently criminalize them. So, and I finish with this, just what other alternatives, what other possibilities we might imagine, even those that didn't happen in the past, those that were put in a pocket because they were not the dominant strategies, although they were ideas that many other actors have on how to deal with this social issue of the youth and youth street groups. So what those other imaginations of what could have happened, we can imagine to think about the future in order to deal with the current context. And I'm going to finish this now. Thank you so much. Sorry for hurry up.
Thanks a lot, Begoña. And now we will go on with a presentation by Ana San Martí y Roger Soler y Martí of another work package of this project, LEBAN. Ana San Martí, she's connected by Zoom. Hopefully she can hear us, and later on we will see her also. But to present her briefly, she holds a PhD in sociology from the Complutense University of Madrid and is Deputy Director of the Queen Sofia Center on Adolescence and Youth in Madrid. And here, Roger Soler y Martí holds a PhD in political science from the Universidad Pompeu Fabra, and he has participated in the TRANSGANG project in the methodological part, and is currently a Maria Zambrano postdoctoral researcher at the EGOP, I don't know if I pronounced this correctly, of the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. And they both were coordinators of the work package 1 of the LEBAN project, and it would be great if you do a presentation by 15 minutes. We would appreciate that. Go on. Thanks.
Hello. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
Thank you so much. For me, it has been a pleasure and a learning experience to be part of this project. And I will briefly present what the work package number 1, Gangs, Society and Big Data, has consisted of, a group that Roger Soler and myself have coordinated. Well, the main objective was to carry out a macro analysis on social perceptions on safety, criminality, and gangs. In this work package, we analyzed the discourses and the social perception about gangs or youth street groups, comparing different contexts in Spain and in Latin America, and analyzing similarities and differences. In Spain, we have few studies on gangs. More specifically, we talk about data generation on social perception of the general population around this reality. In general terms, we wanted to answer a series of questions as: do people know gangs? What do people know about them? What does the information they have come from? What image do people have of gangs and their members? And what measures could be taken to facilitate coexistence in neighborhoods to stop possible crimes and not to fuel hate speech? Well, since the beginning of the 21st century, the public image of gangs in Spain has been closely associated with crime and stigmatization, and it's a concept closely linked to migratory phenomenon. In Latin America context, the emergence of youth street groups in the marginal neighborhoods of large cities has different characteristics and dimensions, but the image of this group in public opinion is also associated with crime. So in this work package, we analyze the social perception of gangs using 2 methodologies, social network analysis and an online survey. In the first place, the methodology of social network analysis is oriented to identify the process of information exchange that take place in this virtual arena. The main source of data will come from Twitter, but also from press, blogs, and forums. And it is limited to a certain period between July 2010 and April 2012, plus a case of study on February 2022. The messages analyzed are in Spanish and Catalan, and Brandwatch is the tool that has been used, a monitoring tool applied to 4 types of channels: press, blogs, forums, and Twitter. And a process has been followed. First, we do a selection of a query or a set of keywords and a content analysis of the mentions collected, classified in 2 ways. Categories referring to the group to which mentions refers, as Latin King, Nietas, etc., and 21 thematic categories as legislations, racism, immigration process, mediation process, etc. Of all the information that has been collected, some findings can be mentioned. First, a clearly stigmatizing content has been found in the references to gangs. The themes associated with youth gangs tend to criminalize their members, and this situation is maintained with a relatively stable volume of mention in the analyzed period. The presence of counter-narratives about youth gangs in the network is practically non-existent. Since 2018, there has been a drastic increase in the volume of mention of menas and campaign foreign minors in Spanish, a new group that suffers the attacks of a very specific group led by the extreme right. The attacks focuses on the criminalization of the collective in the conversation on Twitter. 28% of the analyzed mention associate menace with violence and conflict, and 15% with crimes as robbery, drugs trafficking, sexual assault, etc. But in this case, compared with what happened with gangs, there is a significant presence of counter-narratives and profiles of the political left that tries to confront stigmatizing messages. And since February 2022, the case of study shows a new perspective that questions the term Latino associated with a stigmatizing view of gangs. And the online survey carried out between the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022 has been designed to compare the social perception of gangs in different places, selected because they represented diverse socio-political contexts and faced the presence and activity of gangs with public policy of diverse orientation. The survey has been carried out in different metropolitan areas as Barcelona, Madrid, Valencia, and Bogota, and in 3 countries, Ecuador, El Salvador, and Morocco. An online panel has been used with samples selected according to criteria of statistical representativeness by gender, age, and socioeconomic level. And the questionnaire collects information refers to the perception of security and insecurity in the municipality or neighborhood of residents of the people interviewed, the ideas about immigration, the knowledge and information about gangs, and the opinion on the policies applies in each context. And now Roger continues with the explanation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Anna. I just will give some results because I think yesterday you already saw some results on the social media analysis presented for somebody here in the room, and I will give just some results on the survey analysis. One thing I would like to highlight is as the book is one of the outputs of the project, also the survey, I think it's in itself a relevant contribution to the field because we didn't find any survey asking specifically on perception of gangs. And so we have very interesting data that needs to be analyzed further. And here, just in 7 minutes, I will try just to give a very plain and descriptive output of what we have seen in this survey. But I insist, having experts in the room, that it will be very interesting to analyze it further. I have some. They are there. Okay. I will start by the end. I've changed my order of presentation because I will start answering the question of this session. It is possible to legalize gangs. Well, if we look at the perceptions of public opinion, of general population, I have to give you bad news, because the truth is that public opinion does not support this measure of legalizing, expressed like these, gangs. But as Begoña said, there are other kind of approximations to what can be done with gangs, no? And we have also asked these kind of questions, asking for other measures in terms of more inclusive policies related to gangs, and the results are more or less the same. So we have to say that public opinion in general does not support this kind of inclusive policies. No? So the question here is why this happens. No? And the survey gives us some ideas on why this happens. No? And we have to look at the opinions that people has on gangs. So let's move to that, and let's see what are the opinions that people have regarding towards gangs. These are the results of an open question. This is a word cloud with an open question where we ask, when you listen to talk about Latin gangs, or this in Spain was called bandas latinas, in Latin America, in Ecuador and El Salvador, it was called pandillas. When you listen to talk about these gangs, what is the first thing that comes into your mind? And as you can see, because I'm sure that most of you speak Spanish and read Spanish, but as you can see, the words that appear are related to fear, to fights, to death, to crime. So these are all concepts related to bad opinions, let's say, or opinions that are related to criminalization, to this kind of framework. No? We also ask other questions about the opinion towards gangs to the sample, and all these kind of questions answered. All these indicators show that there is a bad opinion. Let's say it like this. No, it has to be said that there is also a minority but existent dimension within the opinions towards gangs that is more related to a more comprehensive vision of gangs. So there is a little light for hope, no? Because if we think on measures of enhancing this kind of this dimension that is also associated to gangs, that is more related to their communitarian values and actions, we can think that it is possible to change this opinion that we have seen. No? So once we see that there is a bad opinion on gangs, we have to ask about where does this opinion come from? No? And one thing that the hypothesis that we had is that people doesn't have a direct knowledge on gangs. So we ask on the perception of presence of gangs in the neighborhood, in order to look if this opinion was based on a direct experience or was based in more narrative, mediatic opinion on gangs. And what we see is that around 90-95% in the case of Spain and Ecuador of the people says that they have never seen gangs with different options of answers, but they say that they have never seen gangs in their neighborhood. So we can conclude that there is not a direct, this bad opinion on gangs is not based on a direct contact with them, but, well, the next question is, so where does this opinion comes from, no? And the next figure tries to answer this. No? We ask about where does people get information about gangs. That we have a battery of many different channels of information, and here this figure tries to capture, merging some of the answers, tries to capture if I have 1 minute, but I'm finishing. If this information came from a direct contact of gangs or how it was mediated. And what we see is that around 80% in Valencia, 70% in Madrid or Barcelona of this information comes from indirect channels of information. That means from mass media, from social media, or even from opinions from other people. So the conclusion is that this opinion that sustains also the opinion on policies towards gangs is based on opinions that are mainly constructed through mediatic narratives. So this is probably not new, but what is new is that this idea of the importance of how we talk about gangs and how they are represented in media and in social media. The new is that we have quantitative data, so we can corroborate these kind of conclusions that we had already seen in the literature in more qualitative views. And that's
Thanks a lot, Roger and Anna, for your presentation, and sorry to cut you off at the end. So now we would like to go over to Sabina Puig. I will briefly present her. She holds a degree in political science and administration from the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona and a master's degree in international law and human rights. Since 2010, she has been working at the Catalan International Institute for Peace, the ICIP, where she looks at violence outside war context. She has been the coordinator of the work package 2 in LEBAN. And Sabina, go ahead. 15 minutes if you can make it. Thanks.
Hello, hola, bon dia, buenos dias, bonjour. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your attendance. And thanks to LEBAN coordinators for inviting ICIP to participate in this research project. Special thanks to Sonia. She's actually the heart and soul of this working group. And I didn't know her before, and it has really been a pleasure to work with her. I wanted to mention that publicly. And I also wanted to thank the rest of the team and mention them here. Celia Premat, Elizabeth Fuentes, Manuel Torre, Miquel Úbeda, and Raúl Calvo. Really a pleasure to work with them too. Anneli mentioned ICIP. ICIP is the International Catalan Institute for Peace, which is a public institution that was created by the Catalan Parliament at the demand of civil society. Having a public institution aimed at promoting peace is not very usual, and as we have an international attendance, I wanted to introduce you this organization who promotes culture of peace in our country, but also abroad through research, knowledge transfer, outreach, and support to peace initiatives. Peace is a very large field of work, but as no, it's okay. As Nele was mentioning, one area of work is looking how we can build peace in settings with very high levels of violence, but that are not considered to be at war. And it is working on these issues that we met Carlos a number of years ago and that we've been in touch ever since. But enough talking about ICIP. I have here some information if anyone is interested, because I've been asked to give a brief report on what we've done at Work Package 2. How does it work? sorry, this was about ICIP. Okay, work package 2. At our very first meeting, we had the very ambitious plan to track the situations of gangs Barcelona, Madrid, Valencia, which was quickly dismissed because of lack of direct information, El Salvador and Ecuador, focusing, as Sonia also mentioned, on the legislative political dimension and also on case law, on jurisprudence, and also to compare that with trends in the media and public opinion. As you can feel, it is very associated to what has been done in other work packages. We wanted to check how these different dimensions interrelated and fed on one another. At our second or third meeting, we realized that we were too ambitious and that we had no human resources, no time enough to go and to make these exhaustive explorations. But we nonetheless proceeded with the elaboration of a chronology that would put together the relevant milestones in each of these situations and dimensions. So the idea was to recompile information in an organized and visual way that could also be of assistance to other LEBAN work packages. This chronology that goes from 2000 to 2020 wasn't just meant to offer a visual idea of the evolution over time of policies regarding bans in this different context. This has already been developed by Sonia, so I won't extend on this right now. And a third outcome of this work package 2, and maybe it's less explicit and it will probably not appear in any final report, but we took real advantage of the diversity in the team to learn from each other. We were a small group, but had experts in criminal law, restorative practices, anthropology, sociology, peace studies, human rights, sociology, and all this. I mean, it really gave us a very appreciated space of knowledge transfer, and I think it is one of the richness of this LEBAN project, not to talk among each other and each one from a different perspective. So we had several internal meetings, and we also held a couple of public seminars, both of them on El Salvador. The first one with Chris van der Borg from Utrecht University, and the second one with journalist Juan Martínez de Buisson from El Faro, also El Salvador. What I'd like to... sorry, I'm dismissing the PowerPoint. What I'd like to share with you today and very quickly is what we have learned from these discussions, but what we have learned from a peace perspective. I've put my peace building lens and to understand what bans actually are and what are the best policies to address the phenomenon. I mean, you are all experts in juvenile associations. I am not. This was new to me. And that's what my learnings and ICIP learnings, because these are things that we have also discussed in our team, no? How to face bans from a peace perspective. Don't take me wrong, because most of the comments that will follow refer to violent conflicts and problems related to gangs. But we do not associate all bans with crime and violence. We understand that bans have different expressions and take different forms. And this is actually one of our major issues with the project. In our initial discussions, the idea was raised to compare Spain, El Salvador, and Ecuador to understand better bans and to know which policies would suit better in each case. But how far common appraisals are possible when we talk about bans? It was very difficult for us to compare Mara Salvadoreñans at their peak of violence with what was happening in the streets of Madrid and Barcelona. So we do understand the usefulness to have a large and flexible definition of gangs, to adapt it to different expressions, but we long debated, is it okay to include in the same, even in the same research or in a single publication, realities like the Mara Salvatrucha, Barrio 18, and then bands here in Barcelona or in Madrid, bands that may have some members involved in petty crimes, but nothing to do with violence in El Salvador. Also, putting them in the same pack as bands that define themselves more on identity, cultural, or leisure character. No, that this is something that, something we didn't feel at ease at all the time with this. We didn't feel at ease, not in an academic perspective, but we were already. Okay. Because of the impact on public opinion. No, in Spain, this has already been said, we have heard politicians and talk media guests equaling youth bands in Madrid, Barcelona with Mara Salvatrucha. No? And these fourth associations, this has already been said, it's very dangerous. And data exposed by Roger right now is really concerning, and how we put in the same pack two completely real difference. So working with outreach and public opinion, the two is missing. What? Okay. Because practice and studies show us that fear and terror has been used for social and political control, and how juvenile groups have been used for these purposes. So we need second learning. We need to keep doing pedagogy, educational activities, congresses like this one, the documentaries that have been produced in the frame of the project, media interviews that colleagues have been doing all the time, work with communities, with schools. All this is crucial to build other narratives than the hegemonic ones. Third, learning, context-based understanding. You know about it. There's no unique recipe for all conflicts related to bands. We need to know really the local dimensions, the idiosyncrasies, and include in any peace process local actors. I'm going to go very fast now. The fourth, learning, nexus. Okay, there's something that doesn't match. The fourth, I put them all. Okay, the fourth one, in my papers at least, structural and systemic perspective. We need to understand social, cultural, economic, political conditions in which bands arise and expands. No, we often, when we talk about Salvador, we hear the story, the bands that came from the US, but they arrived in a country that had been ravaged by a civil war, a country that had peace agreements, yes, but where culture of violence persisted. There was still a number of armed groups, security forces, justice institutions had not been renewed. There was an extensive sense of impunity. And in a country with serious issues and lack of opportunities for the young ones. At the very beginning, authorities didn't react, and when they did it with mano dura, but they didn't implement youth, health, education, social, cultural policies that were very needed. Things that I'm sure you already know. From a peace perspective, another important point, always taking into account the nexus between local and global phenomena. Local approach is key, we've seen that, but bands have transnational connections. That was exposed yesterday. So, how many minutes? Okay. The sixth, My sixth point is what do we know exactly about the relationship between bans and violence? Because we tend, the imaginary is not tend to associate it, but it is not necessarily like that, no? In places where they exercise their power, they can sometimes regulate the number of homicides, for instance, no? When it suits them, they even reduce the level of violence. We saw that also in El Salvador. The use of violence by bands, by criminal groups, is not an irrational thing. In many cases, it is highly tactic. So we need to understand when and why they use violence and in which way, which levels, and what they want to do with that violence. My seventh point would be another interpretation of security, the hegemonic one in everywhere. Is a very restricted and exclusive position, a position that does not take into account the plurality of vulnerabilities, of threats and needs. And it's a position that prioritizes control and order over the full exercise of human rights. At ICIP, we always say that a more human security approach is much more gives much more benefits than the one we know. My eighth point would be a critical approach to the culture of punishment. Begoña has already mentioned that. I want to mention also a very recent publication that colleagues have done at ICIP, where they question this very rooted value in most of our societies that contribute to reinforce and to perpetuate violence. How we understand justice in a different way. And here we could talk about restorative practices that in the end are proved to be more reparative at individual level, in particular for victims, and more transformative in the social and political dimensions. And talking about restorative justice in any case means favoring impunity. You all know that as well. My 9 points would be how to keep promoting social cohesion, social dialogue as a way to prevent violence and polarizing and hate speeches to enter in the community. And the 10th point, also with a peace perspective, is and again, Begoña has already introduced that in her presentation. Bans in, bans out, criminalization, legalization, punishment, integration, but between these two options, often led by institutions and well-intentioned NGOs, one wonders, where are the youth? What do they want? And aren't we trying, at the end of the day, to put them in frames that have been built without them? Last thought I would like to share with you is that is a mention to this new situation that is of great concern, the state of emergency in El Salvador and all the associated authoritarian practices. Some people in the room know much better the situation there, are in much better position to explain it. But my point is that while we were discussing in academic terms here in Catalonia the pros and cons of mano dura, pros and cons of progressive policies, a regime of repression was taken to extremes in a country and with approval of its population or most of its population. And the justification for it has been the bans. And now we see how politicians from other countries, mainly Latin American countries, applaud these measures and wait their turn to be able to implement them in their respective countries. So this gives us an idea of the work we have ahead to keep proposing, to keep promoting more human responses to human phenomena. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sabina. And now we will go on with Hector Grat. I will present him very briefly. He's an associate professor in the Department of Social Anthropology and Spanish Thought at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, and he holds a PhD in social psychology from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. So, yes, you do the presentation together with René or separate? So, separate? Okay. So, Hector, go ahead. Thanks. If you could keep it to 10 minutes, it would be just great.
Well,
but
I will try to do it as fast as possible. In fact, my presentation will be very brief because most of the background was already done by Sonia and Begoña. The work that I will present is, in fact, a collective work with Begoña Aramoya and Mario Oliver together in the Madrid team. As Begoña and Sonia already said, Madrid is one of the archetypical cases of the hard hand policy against Latino groups. And we did an extensive field work in many years in the framework of TRANSGANG and previous researchers, and then also a focus group in the framework of the current LEBAN project. And I will just then outline the main, try to summarize, to outline the main outcomes, the main conclusions of our work. The first is regarding the direct outcomes or direct effects of criminalization and punitive strategy in Madrid. We saw, and also in the focus group, it was alright. So the focus group was convened with the representatives of all the sectors, of all the actors that were involved in the intervention with gangs in Madrid. And one of the main results that we can say from the we can find of the criminalization strategy is that the erosion of leadership. Leaders were in several waves of detentions, were detained and prosecuted, and even were jailed, accused of being members of illegal groups, and that means that the positive leaders were eliminated from the groups, and that the first outcome of this leadership erosion was a higher violence, in fact, because intergroup fights in Madrid. After the 2006 and 2007, that were the major trials at that time. The second is the complement of the erosion of the leadership was the logic of the imposition of a logic of the problem of the gangs will be overcome by dissolution, by depletion of the gangs. That people just repression will avoid people to join the gangs, and in the absence of any leadership or orientation, they will disappear by themselves. The reality shows that the effect of this assumption was exactly the opposite. The media coverage and the silence of gangs in the media had a call effect for another youth groups that felt marginalized in Madrid society, and they joined the Latin gangs even in higher numbers than before. The third effect of decriminalization was the making hard any alternative paradigm of intervention about gangs. In fact, attempts to translate the Barcelona model to Madrid, the Barcelona model of mediation to Madrid, failed because lack of any institutional support, or even the ombudsman for minors in Madrid was removed because he expressed once a small support for legalization of Latin groups as legal associations. And well, that was one of the interesting points, because in spite of that failure, actors that were involved in the process remember that process as a positive experience, and they would like to go back to another attempts. But well, one of the collateral outcomes of the criminalization and then the avoiding of any mediation process was the further split within the gangs, within the Latin groups, between those supporting new attempts or new trials to mediation, and those against any institutional contact or any institutional negotiation, because because the past negative experiences. Another outcome of the last maybe outcome of the criminalization policy was the weakening of the main of the big groups at the beginning of the process that had a more political orientation, Latin King and their anti-racist and their policy or their activity, their action against structural racism and institutional racism, and Nieta's work against the jail system and their discrimination in the prosecution in the legal prosecution of the members of the gangs, on the Latino in general. And they were because all the processes, Latin King and Nietas were surpassed by Dominican Domplays and Trinitarios as the main groups in Madrid, and their looser structure and their rejection of institutional negotiation or institutional links make harder any future intention of opening new mediation processes. That's a very negative, as you can see, picture. Just in order to finish, that negative. 1 minute. In spite of all these negative experiences in the Madrid team, we arise some questions, some hypothetical questions, in fact, about what would be the situation with another strategy. What will be the situation in the anti-racist or the situation of the Latin and other origins youth in Madrid, in case that the policy would have been a different policy, an alternative policy, taking in account the interests of the young people in these groups, their needs, and also the positive aspect, the positive functions of these social groups as organizing or structuring migrant groups in our society, and then working or facilitating their integration as citizens, as full citizens in our society. Yeah. So that's an open question that we think that some of the results of this research give some lights on that.
Thanks a lot, Hector. And now we will go on with René to my left side. René Undalara holds a PhD in Social Sciences, Childhood and Youth from the Salesian Polytechnic University. He is member of the research group on childhood, adolescence and youth, and currently works at the Research Center on Childhood, Adolescence and Youth at the same Salesian Polytechnic University. Go ahead, René. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm so glad to be here and to have the possibility of to learn and to share knowledge of this complex problematics. And I would like to start by thanking to Professor Carles Feixa, who has invited me to participate in this project last 3 years. In order to save time, I will mainly read off my presentation. It's a short version of the chapter about Ecuador in the book Bands Out, Bands In. Well, I hope my English is good enough, but please excuse me any pronunciation difficulty that I may have. Please, this one. I show the guidelines in the slides. In order to comprehend the youth street groups in Ecuador and their mediation process, it's compulsive to situate at least 3 moments that have characterized the country's life since the last couple decades of the 20th century. Between the 80s and 90s, neoliberal policies are installed which precarize the life of the majority of the population, fixing context they facilitate the emergence of gangs. The increase of the manslaughter rate was followed by certain firm hand or super firm hand initiatives that failed to overcome these issues. Thereby, the confluence of several institutions and organizations is produced adopting the Barcelona model. Barcelona model as a successful mediation experience. Henceforth, a process is started in which is attempted to change society perspective regarding young gang members. Gangs are socially produced reality in the measure that they are a product of established social relationships that have intentionally constituted them. From the abandonment policies, precariousness, and austericide policies. Thus, there is a wide, strong consensus among the researchers of this public problem, accepted that the confirmation of gangs owes to the confluence of many factors, of a series of factors relative to structural deficiencies, such as employment, education, healthcare, public security, and to the necessity to attenuate their derivative effects through collective strategies of economic subsistence and group tactics for protection against violence and insecurity, which generates a complex framework of affections and loyalties. Next one, please. The hypothesis that traverses this work poses that in the Ecuadorian case, the exclusionary and authoritarian policies of the neoliberal states of the 19th that were the structural causal factors of gang phenomenon were partially reverted or reconducted by the states' convergence social organizations, and mainly by the leading actors, in this case Latin kings, whom promoted and cemented their legalization and challenging integration in 2007, 2008 in societal terms, to the new context of opportunities that was settled with a progressive cycle of government, government between 2007 and 2017. The balance of the experience of institutional mediation implemented during the first decade of the current century in Ecuador with the Latin Kings organization and in lesser measure with the Nietas shows that gang violence has significantly decreased in general terms, reflecting a sharp reduction in the manslaughter rate between 2010 and 2017. Since 2018, the return of the neoliberal policies and the radicalization of fiscal austerity in detriment of public security and in general of the public sphere has positioned Ecuador among the most violent countries of the region. Some tendencies, this graphic displays the evolution of homicides in Latin American countries and the Caribbean, which demonstrates a significant increase is the manslaughter rate in Ecuador, 82% to be precise, between 2018 and 2022. As you can see, this is the most notorious increase present in the region, according to the Inside Crime report on the subject. Next one, please. Furthermore, 2023 has been the most violent year ever recorded in the Ecuadorian history, as you can see, with a stunning cipher of 4,603 homicides, which explain the pronounced increasement as an expression of the abandonment and neglect of the state about public policies. It's a moment of the state against society. States against society. Next one, please. And next one, tendencies in Ecuador. Next, okay. Next one. Final thoughts. It's possible to legalize gangs. This is the question mainly question this work developed in the last 3 years. Retaking the main question of this work, of this conference, let me ask you, it is possible to legalize gangs? Beginning, the answer can be yes, is yes, under the appropriate conditions, which are the existence of a state that guarantees the propulsion of policies oriented to the societal integration. This translates to socioeconomic initiatives that allows the reduction of inequality conditions and that helps promote the culture that emerges from this paradigm, rather than destroy them. A second idea turn around the political cycles and government policies. The political cycles in Ecuador condition the government policies, which can lead to processes of societal integration. But in the other hand, detractors of this point of view might take away all the work done and leave us in a previously seen scenario of violence or even worse. This is a consequence of the lack of institutional effectiveness regarding the role of societal integration, which can be appreciated as the insurance of a public sphere that provides a series of social services. Thus, the fight for recognition and social equality remains, unfortunately, a political struggle of a daily basis. Third idea on public policies, bottom-up and top-down policies, a classic item. Even before the arrival of the progressive government in 2007, the social basis, that is the gangs and society, started tackling this issue with the purpose of getting recognition of the cultural identity. However, the policies projected by Rafael Correa government took the societal integration of gangs a step further by institutionalizing the social desire to create a more dignified social structure in which public services were guaranteed and cultural identities could develop free of discrimination. Also, it wasn't enough for many reasons, such strong struggle for common sense, the role of media, and mainly because of the political display of financial elites. No? This is important point. Political display of financial elites. Finally, I would like to remark the necessity to impulse values of equality through redistribution, cultural recognition, and public wellness. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, René. I know you heard a lot of information, a lot of presentations, but we have a last one from our team colleagues. They are connected also by Zoom, so if we could have the connection by Zoom again. And I will present briefly Jose Javier Navarro. He holds a PhD in local development and territory from the University of Valencia. He has a diploma in social work and degree in criminology. And at present, he's a lecturer and researcher at the Department of Social Work and Social Services and PI of the Gezin Group. So please, if you already would like to leave the session, it's okay, but we would like to give the opportunity for the rest of the colleagues to share the presentation, okay? Thanks. And we have by Zoom also Mercedes Botija. She holds a PhD in social sciences, a diploma and graduate degree in social work from the University of Valencia, and research teaching staff. She's a research teaching staff at the university, lecturer in the Department of Social Work and Social Services. So if we could have the connection, please. Yeah, we can see you. Jota, we can see you. And Mercedes, I guess she... Okay.
Mercedes no está.
Okay, so yes, Jota will do his presentation in Spanish, and then after Maria is so kind to give us a brief summary in English. So go ahead, Jota, thanks.
Bueno, en primer lugar, disculpad mi falta de competencia lingüística en inglés. Voy a tener el apoyo de María, que agradezco enormemente, porque de lo contrario pues no podría hacer esta presentación. Como Mercedes no está, porque ya os cuento que tenía una reunión, la había citado al Ministerio hoy, justamente hoy, no sé si voy a tener la posibilidad de ocupar sus minutos o me limito a los 10 que tengo yo. Yo voy a intentar ser lo más rápido posible, porque además veo que ya me quedarían a mí 9 minutos. Entonces voy a tratar de ser lo más expeditivo posible. Voy hablando y después María hace una síntesis, o voy parando y María traduce. ¿Cómo?
As you prefer, como prefieras, como te sea más fácil.
Bueno, yo creo que sería mejor, si puede ser, hacer una exposición completa y luego María, pues...
Lo hacemos de esta forma. Vale, si puedes usar estos 10 minutos, pues perfecto. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, voy a intentar hacerlo en 10 minutos. Va a ser complicado, pero voy a intentarlo, ¿de acuerdo? Bueno, en primer lugar, nosotros desarrollamos el Work Package 4, que es titulado Políticas Públicas y Reducción de la Violencia, y en este Work Package, liderado por el grupo GESIN de investigación, estamos Mercedes Botija, Ángela Carbonell, Virginia Prades, Sara Martínez, Alberto Martínez, aunque posteriormente pasó a otro Work Package por su condición de investigador salvadoreño, experto en pandillas en El Salvador, y yo mismo. Me gustaría iniciar mi presentación, conectándolo con el título de esta ponencia, ¿no? De esta mesa redonda. El título de esta mesa redonda era ¿Is possible to legalize gangs? ¿Es posible legalizar las pandillas? Bueno, pues yo voy a crear una contrapregunta para después, posteriormente, entrar en un proceso reflexivo que tal vez puede ser participativo e interesante. Y que es un proceso que conecta mucho con la exposición que han hecho tanto Héctor como Roger, y tanto también como con Begoña. Y mi pregunta a esta pregunta de esta mesa sería: ¿qué crea más problemas? ¿Las pandillas o la desinformación generalizada sobre los jóvenes en las pandillas? En este sentido, yo voy a tratar de centrar mi exposición alrededor de 5 puntos. Estos 5 puntos serían los siguientes. El primero, con unas notas iniciales sobre la juventud y los jóvenes. El segundo punto, desde mi punto de vista absolutamente fundamental para entender cómo se puede reducir y cómo se puede afrontar la violencia, es entender la diferencia que existe entre los factores que son vulnerables y aquellos que generan exclusión. Es decir, la diferencia entre la vulnerabilidad y la exclusión. El tercer apartado, dado que nuestro equipo ha liderado, desarrollado una checklist para las buenas prácticas en políticas públicas y de juventud y bueno, pues mediación para la reducción de la violencia y procesos de pacificación, etcétera, pues bueno, presentaré algunas indicaciones para algunas implicaciones que tienen las buenas prácticas para presentar la lista. Después creo que es importante, desde la perspectiva de cómo articular las políticas que permiten posibilitar estas prácticas. Y por último lugar, si da tiempo, pues algunas estrategias para poder afrontarlas. En primer lugar, creo que es importante que abordemos de dónde venimos. Y de dónde venimos es de la influencia que tiene el positivismo jurídico para la confusión habitual en la representación de cómo se representan los jóvenes. Es decir, el positivismo jurídico aborda a los jóvenes como objeto de protección, no como una perspectiva freiriana de la educación que podríamos abordarla desde sujetos para la transformación o sujetos de transformación. Es decir, en este punto de partida donde los jóvenes son objeto de protección, es decir, legitima de alguna manera las políticas o las malas políticas para hacer lo que quieran sobre los jóvenes, ¿no? Entonces, este es un punto de análisis sobre el que creo que debemos considerar. En segundo lugar, creo que es fundamental integrar qué elementos o qué factores provocan o suponen vulnerabilidad y qué factores provocan ese segundo paso que sería la exclusión. Esto tiene que ver, esto está mediado a través de las situaciones de riesgo. Es decir, una situación de riesgo implica que haya factores como, por ejemplo, la fragilidad familiar o las carencias en cuanto a las habilidades personales o el entorno social o una inexistencia o exigua red de apoyo o un tipo de afectividad desajustada que generan situaciones de riesgo, sin más, ¿vale? De ahí a un segundo lugar es cuando entran las políticas. Por un lado, son competencias, podríamos decir, de la propia socialización, pero ahora es cuando entran las políticas, en los factores que generan exclusión. ¿Y qué factores generan exclusión? Pues sobre todo los factores que tienen que ver con los sistemas de bienestar o con el boicot de los sistemas de bienestar, que es donde encontramos los jóvenes que tienen dificultades en su contexto inmediato, ¿no? Y que son boicot en los sistemas educativos, boicot en los sistemas culturales, boicot en el empleo, boicot en el acceso a alternativas de ocio saludable, de ocio tiempo libre, es decir, en aquellas líneas en las que son las políticas responsables de articular unos procesos alternativos ante la dificultad de estos jóvenes. Para las buenas prácticas, entramos en el tercer punto, estoy tratando de ser bastante rápido. ¿Qué implicaciones habrían previas a las buenas prácticas? Pues bueno, en primer lugar, nosotros consideramos, después del estudio que hemos realizado y de las entrevistas y demás, que es fundamental identificar las necesidades desde la perspectiva de los sujetos. Es decir, partiendo de la base de los jóvenes, por eso nuestro capítulo en Bandas Fuera, Bandas Dentro se orientaba en función de políticas con y no políticas para los jóvenes, políticas con los jóvenes y no políticas para los jóvenes, ¿no? Por otro lado, en la participación activa de los destinatarios, en la flexibilidad y adaptabilidad de los procesos y en la consideración de aquellos colectivos que, volviendo al punto anterior, integran situaciones de riesgo como primer paso y como situaciones de riesgo segundo paso, como vulnerabilidad o como exclusión. Y después, por último punto, pues valorar la perspectiva de género, la diversidad y los aspectos ecológicos. Para el desarrollo de la checklist sobre buenas prácticas en políticas públicas sobre articulación de políticas de mediación en cuanto a legalización o procesos de pacificación en pandillas. Bueno, os puedo explicar un poquito brevemente cómo fue el procedimiento. En primer lugar, se hizo una revisión bibliográfica de bases científicas y literatura gris, consultando metabuscadores y la European Association for Grey Literature Exploitation, la EAGLE. Posteriormente se construyó una lista de indicadores que se construyó a partir de la participación de los propios investigadores de este grupo, apoyados por un investigador externo vinculado a LEBAN, por José Sánchez, y se desarrolló una lista de indicadores en áreas hasta construir la checklist piloto, que tratamos de verificar mediante la implementación del método Delphi. Es decir,
Jota, disculpa,
tratando de dar...
5 minutos, ¿vale? Solo para que lo tengas en cuenta. Muchas gracias.
Bien. Vale, pues voy a directamente a pasar a otra cosa porque no me va a dar tiempo absolutamente a nada. Bien, en función de esto, los participantes en el estudio fueron 32 expertos, de los cuales finalmente finalizaron la Delphi en 2 rondas 30. Con trayectoria académica y experiencia profesional suficiente para el contenido para el que se les había consultado. Y bueno, os presento, si se valora interesante, las áreas únicamente, porque no vamos a entrar a los indicadores que finalmente tuvo la checklist. En primer lugar, buena práctica. En segundo lugar, proyecto de acción concreta, con 6 subindicadores o 6 subapartados que considero que son interesantes, pero tal vez para otro espacio. En tercer lugar, el área de género, con una subárea de igualdad y otra subárea de no discriminación. En cuarto lugar, la diversidad y la inclusión respecto a las poblaciones y culturas. Y en quinto lugar, el área ecológica, tratando de evitar impactos negativos y la revisión de impactos positivos y la postdifusión. Esto fue la checklist. Entonces, desde esta perspectiva de la creación de esta checklist, bueno, ¿cómo pueden articular? La pregunta sería, ¿cómo las políticas pueden permitir o pueden articular esto? Bueno, pues desde nuestro punto de vista, lógicamente mediante la interacción de actores institucionales en relación directa con los jóvenes y sus grupos. Yo recuerdo una entrevista, un verbatio que nos dio un experto, que nos decía: el sector de la mediación y la solidaridad todavía, con mayúsculas, no está mercantilizado. Por tanto, hay que aprovechar este escenario para tratar de articular propuestas que incluyan algunos aspectos como, por ejemplo, la implicación personal en los procesos. Y podemos decir, ¿cómo? ¿Los políticos? ¿Implicación personal? ¿Eso qué quiere decir? Bueno, sí, pues implicación personal se puede articular desde una perspectiva de planificación de lo que se desea realizar, planificación política con coste en la aplicación real. Es decir, con profesionales expertos que conozcan y puedan bordear el perímetro para acercarse a la socialización de estos jóvenes, con una atención concreta al tiempo y al proceso. Es decir, desde evitar la prisa en la comunicación, o que la prisa, o muchas veces pasamos a cuestiones que no son urgentes que lo sean y las importantes quedan en un segundo plano, ¿no? Y por último, a tratar de establecer estigmatizaciones inconscientes, ¿no? Porque este tipo de estigmatizaciones lo que hacen es alejarnos de los jóvenes, ¿no? Y por otro lado, también considero que sería fundamental implicar la afectividad. Es decir, no nos tenemos que olvidar como los profesionales que pueden trabajar con estos colectivos, que forman parte de ellos, es decir, que formamos parte de los jóvenes, pero no somos jóvenes, en mi caso en concreto y en el de la mayoría, ¿no? Formamos parte de ellos, pero no somos uno de ellos. Por tanto, una premisa final que todavía es mucho más importante en este contexto de pandillas y de violencia. Lo que importa es la persona, no tanto los actos que desarrolla. Los actos que desarrolla son juzgados, pero en muchas ocasiones los actos se desarrollan por actuaciones que tienen que ver con la socialización, que tienen que ver con el entorno y no tanto con la persona. Es decir, es importante separar la figura persona de la figura contexto en este tipo de actuaciones. Y todo esto, en muchas ocasiones... ¿Sí?
Sí, por favor,
¿Un minuto? Vale. Bueno, todo esto, lógicamente, debemos exigirle a las políticas que lo hagan desde una perspectiva de la no precarización laboral de las personas que llegan a estos escenarios. Por último, algunas estrategias con los jóvenes. Podríamos hablar de comprensión ante el comportamiento, a tratar de aceptar en todo momento el grupo de iguales, porque de alguna manera considerar las experiencias de convivencia y de satisfacción de alguna manera crean la semilla del futuro, ¿no? Y esto pues son algunas estrategias que nosotros consideramos que se deben aprovechar, del mismo modo que se debe aprovechar el ingenio de vivir todo el día en la calle, ¿no? O de estar en contacto con la calle. La calle crea espacios de naturalidad, espacios de espontaneidad y entendemos esta perspectiva como positiva, ¿no? Bueno, y en este punto también sería importante, para finalizar, descartar la culpabilización de los jóvenes, pero también descartar el victimismo, ¿no? Descartar la culpabilidad, es decir, culpabilizar a los jóvenes no nos lleva a ningún lado, pero tampoco apiadarnos de ellos tampoco nos llega a ningún lugar, ¿no? Entonces, tratar de responsabilizar, pues insisto, en definitiva, con acciones políticas que de alguna manera puedan integrar contenidos educativos, oportunidades y nuevas experiencias de transformación. Recuerdo algunas entrevistas que chavales pandilleros nos decían: si realmente yo lo que quiero es vivir tranquilo y no conducir con 7 ojos en el retrovisor, lo que quiero es una vida normal. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jota. Maria, thank you so much for a brief summary because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be very, very brief and not to miss anything. Okay, so Jota and Mercedes and the rest of the team of the working paper 4 related to public policies and violence reduction answer or the question of is it possible to legalize gangs with another question. This was more problematic: gangs or misinformation about gangs. They have 5 working points that goes from general notes on youth to understanding factors that generate vulnerability and exclusion, making a difference between vulnerability and exclusion. He explains that the team developed a checklist of good practices. They apply this to public policies regarding good practices with the use of the playlist. Of the checklist. It is necessary to learn about risk assessment in order to know about the social risk situation of the young people they are working with. Going back to this idea that vulnerability is not the same as exclusion. When public policies enter in these dynamics, they influence the well-being and the welfare of youth in social exclusion risk, because in many cases access to education or even to resources from free time are a factor of exclusion. Regarding the good practices, they separate politics with young people or politics towards or for good people but without them. And they emphasize the need to take into account the necessities of young people, but also their own ideas on what public policies are needed for them. Regarding the good practices checklist, Jota explains that they built an indicator checklist in general areas, verified and contrasted with local researchers, and the checklist passed a two-way check with the local researchers with 32 experts that verified and helped create the final checklist. This checklist had the areas of good practices, of concrete actions, gender, diversity and inclusion, and also ecology. From the checklist, they asked the question of how can public policies articulate the outcomes of these of the answers of this questionnaire. They understand that it's by direct relationship with young people, and they emphasize the idea that mediation is still or has not still been made a business idea, so they can, with personal implication, use mediation techniques just to get and to connect with young people without forgetting that people, professionals, politicians, and the rest of social agents working with young people share spaces, share experience, but they are not the same as young people. And they also emphasize that it's important to avoid stigmatization, and but to ask for responsibilities. It's very important to separate actions and context from the person, and to realize that some actions can be the result of a context and not necessarily and exclusively responsibility of the person. This doesn't mean that we don't have to ask for responsibilities, but that we need to look further. Finally, he explains that it's necessary to get good laboral conditions for people working with young people, because the precarity of social workers is a situation that goes against the public policies or these good practices that we are trying to put into value with this kind of work, as the work in Package 4 has done. And that's it. I think that's the main points. I hope I haven't missed anything.
Thank you so much, Maria, for this effort, for this great summary. Thanks to all the participants. Sonia will have some last words and some announcements and publicity here. But we would have liked to have a few debate after this, but we are running out of time. We're hungry. We're a little bit tired. So we close it here, and I give the word to Sonia. Thanks.
Nothing. Say thank you to everyone, to the audience, to all the, maybe we know that there are some issues to talk about, and we can do it now in the lunchtime. And also, maybe you can consult these books, or you can ask Sabina, yes? And many of you have received the book, and the others, you have a discount on your package of the Congress. Here are a lot of work that we have tried to summarize here. And so thank you very much for your attention and for your participation, to all the LEBAN team, and to Carles Feixa, of course, for the invitation and the coordination of this project. Thank you very much.